Okay, I will start it, right, Wara? So good evening, everyone. I am Castro Ponuthurai, one of the coordinators of Jaffna Sangam, Tamil-speaking LGBTIQ community, and one of the activists of CWDF, Community Welfare and Development Fund. Queering Politics, a conversation around Mangala's legacy. This virtual discussion was organized by Jaffna Sangam and in collaboration with our fellowship organization CWDF to discuss about the queering political sphere in Sri Lanka. So behalf of Jaffna Sangam and our fellow organization CWDF, I warmly welcome everyone to this event. And before we go to the event, I want to give some technical instruction. So when you are going to speak, only unmute the mic and speak. So otherwise keep the mic muted, so it will help to hear audible, and it will prevent the noises from the individual backgrounds, the individual environments. And I warmly welcome our moderator, Mahendran Thiruvarangan, senior lecturer in English literature, University of Jaffna, to continue this virtual discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Castro, for those opening remarks. Today, we are gathered here to reflect upon the late Minister Mangala Samaraweera's legacy as a political leader who identified himself as a member of the LGBT community, and how he has also contributed to the processes of democratization with regard to issues related to queerness. But when we reflect upon his legacy, we would also talk about, like, how his involvement in queer politics and queer in advancing the rights of the queer community, how it also intersects with issues related to ethnicity and class and economic issues. So I was just eavesdropping some of the conversation that was going on among the panelists as I started this, as I joined Zoom a few minutes ago. So I'm not going to say more, so because the panelists have a lot of interesting things to share with us. And I think this is also an occasion to remember the late Mangala Samaraweera and the ways in which he was an inspiration for many people of this country for very different reasons. But at the same time, I think his legacy is also a very complex legacy, checkered by his, the way he was trying to defend the Wayamba elections, for instance, it's a complex legacy, so people will talk about that, I think, and we may have different opinions about his, about the way he advanced queer politics, about the way he promoted ethnic reconciliation. So I think people will be able to kind of make connections. The panelists will be able to make connections between these issues and the focus of today's conversation, which is queering politics. A conversation around Mangala's legacy. So we have three distinguished speakers with us today. Kumi Samuel, who is a women's rights activist, Wara Thiyagaraja, activist and lecturer, University of Colombo, and Prabha Manuratne, activist and senior lecturer, University of Kelaniya. So each speaker will take about 10 to 15 minutes to share their thoughts and reflections. And at the end of the 10th minute, I would send them a private chat message saying that they have 5 minutes left. And then at the end of the 14th minute, or when the 14th minute begins, I will say, it's time to wrap up. Okay, so now let's open the panel. So our first speaker is Kumi Samuel. She is a women's rights activist. Kumi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Thiru. I must extend my thanks to Wara and Castro, to the Jaffna Sangam and the CWDF for both organizing this and asking me to share some thoughts about Mangala and have a conversation. So thank you very much. When I was thinking of what to say about Mangala, I thought I will speak a bit about, well, reminisce a little bit about some aspects of his political life. And obviously other comments I make will be selective. They're not going to be comprehensive. And nor am I going to make, to provide an analysis, an in-depth analysis at all in terms of what I'm saying. Mangala was sometimes loved, sometimes not. He was, I think, always a controversial figure and very maverick, I think, in his politics. And as you said, you know, there were moments in time when we wouldn't agree with him at all. And there were other moments in which he was able to leverage very important political happenings, movements. And I think I first met him in one such instance. This was in 1990 when I was working at Inform, and it was a time when there was large-scale disappearances in the south of the country, adding to the disappearances that were happening in the north and the east of the country. And we at Inform were also, you know, collecting information, documenting, trying to look for the disappeared, trying to help families. And then Mangala, and actually Mangala together with Mahendran Rajapaksa, who were both opposition MPs of the SLST at the time in Parliament, were also gathering information and organizing women. And that was the beginning of the Southern Mothers Front. It actually started organizing and mobilizing from Mangala's home in Makara. And he was to then come to Inform to ask us if we could help, myself and Sunila and Charles Abesekara, and so on. And at that time, it was, I think, very important that Mangala was able to support the women from the south, from the families of the disappeared. It gave them some element of protection, although there's been a lot of controversy about the role of the SLFP within the mobilizing of the Mothers Front. What he did at the time was very important because he took the risk, and the fact that he organized from his home, the fact that they were then able to have chapters of the Mothers Front very quickly mobilized in, I think at the time, about 20 districts across mostly the southern districts, organizing the mothers, and then giving the movement a public face. And I remember him saying that he was going to model it on the Mothers Front, the Mothers of Plaza del Mayo in Argentina. And Sunila and I talked to him about the Northern Mothers Front of 1984. And he, of course, his antecedent, he was a designer. He worked in advertising, in fashion design, and so on. And he knew the importance of symbolism. He designed this very evocative, although fairly essentialist symbol for the Mothers Front. And then they had the big convention in the South to launch the Mothers Front in 1991. Yes, 1991. And for that, it was interesting. At that time, I think it kind of gendered human rights, because we at Inform and at the Movement for Interracial Justice and Equality were also beginning to mobilize three movements. One called the Movement for Freedom from Fear, with Richard de Soisa, who was disappeared, and Rajani Thiranagama as the face of it, and the Movement for Peace with Democracy, and the Campaign for Constitutional Reform. And I think the Southern Mothers Front, and in what they did with the Padayatras, with the Devakanalawars, and with the big national conventions in Colombo, and particularly the fact that the mothers used very well culturally significant motives of mobilizing and trying to seek justice and trying to seek their disappeared through worship and ritual in kovils and devalayas and temples. It evoked a response from the state in a way that just the search for the missing did not. And although, like I said, there was quite a bit of politicizing of this front, it was mostly members of the Sri Lanka Freedom Party. It was organized by MPs in both the big public rallies in Colombo. The SLFP was to the fore. In the first rally, though, there was Chandrika Bandaranaike, who had also had her husband assassinated. There was Sirimau Bandaranaike, and I remember in the three women that Mangala brought in to speak was a woman from Matara, a woman from the east, I think Batiklo, from the Eastern Mothers Front, and of course Manuratne. So at that point, they tried to see if they could decentralize the work on the disappeared, although by the second year that had actually disappeared. It was more an agenda for regime change. But I think even within that, because Mangala was very much part of this movement that was looking for a peaceful solution to the conflict and looking for constitutional reform, he was able to, or he was part of the section within the SLFP, then in government, that launched the Sudunelu movement. And I remember, although we didn't, as civil society, we didn't really engage with the Sudunelu movement, it was a very important moment in that we were able to discuss, it brought into the political forefront the question of devolution, the 13th Amendment, and also federalism. At that point, federalism was not the F word, the bad word that it has become now. We could talk about federalism. And I think part of the work that Mangala did and that in the early 90s led to the possibility of something like Sudunelu. And of course, the package with the first constitution, draft constitution, which was quite progressive and later on watered down. Of course, we know what happened, politics of that. And then, of course, in Chandrika's time, while he was in government, we had the war for peace and going back to a military solution to the conflict. But within that time, I think he was also quite instrumental in getting the government, of course, helmed by Chandrika, to establish the commissions of the disappeared. And I think in later years, particularly post 2015, with the Geneva Resolution and with the transitional justice mechanisms that he sort of imagined, he brought into the discussion the possibility of the Office for Missing Persons, the Office for Reparations. I know he had very much the thought of a TRC, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and also a good, strong accountability mechanism. Those two, the latter, were not possible in his lifetime during the period of the last government, but I know he spoke of that often. It was very much part of what he felt we absolutely needed, together with constitutional reform. So that was part of his, I think, his liberal human rights and conflict resolution, political resolution to conflict aspect of his politics. Although, of course, he stayed in politics through Chandrika's period, and then in 2005 with Mahendra Rajapaksa, and of course then the war, which did not at all envisage a political solution to the conflict. And I think in that time he broke away, or he broke away from the main faction of the SLFP to start the Ma group, the Mahajana Khandayama, I think, which was which was challenging the politics of the Rajapaksas, particularly vis-a-vis human rights and vis-a-vis the conflict. So this was part of his legacy and something that I remember being part of and having discussions with him at the time. For me, it was a very important period in our history, which finally allowed for us to go beyond what narrow conventional politics was trying to identify for us as what should be the politics of Sri Lanka. The other piece of his work, I think, was very much linked to identity and identity politics as he saw for Sri Lanka, Sri Lankan identity that respected diversity and difference. And I think his queer politics, if we may call it that, or his queer identity, was also located within that understanding. Although I think there will be conversations today on his queer politics and activism, or was it activism or not. I remember for the longest time that he was always pilloried in Parliament and outside in the political domain for being queer, for being gay. And he always acknowledged his queerness. He didn't at all shirk from that. He may not have promoted a public movement overtly, but I think he definitely, for himself, for him, the personal, I think, was very much the political, and he didn't shirk from that identification. It was very telling, I think, during was it 2018? Yes, during 2018, when Maithripala Sirisena made that, when he stigmatized or sought to stigmatize the queer community by calling them butterflies. It was also an attack against Mangala, and he most famously, memorably said, "I would rather be a butterfly, Mr. President, than a leech." And I think that was another important statement, which at the time when we were trying to politicize queer politics, was, I think, very, very important for us. The other piece of his work, interestingly, and always, I think, at the cusp of regime change, he was the mover, the motivator, the strategist for all governments, I believe, as he was with the early days of the Mothers' Front. He was the strategist. Mahinda Rajapaksa was at points the public face, but I think Mangala was the strategist, and he did that through all governments that he was in. And finally, in the last year of his life, last year and a half, when he was not in formal parliamentary politics and he was outside, I think he was again trying to build a new imagining for Sri Lanka. And I know many people, I think he approached both political friends, he approached people who might not have been that friendly to him politically, he approached the human rights community, civil society, many of whom were just invited to have discussions and conversations with him to try and define what he saw as a new vision for the country. And I think it was here that he started to look again at the concept of patriotism. And I think this is very contentious. I remember reading about it and thinking, oh my God, not patriotism, because it has been so used and abused and has been so contentious and dangerous at some level to many of us. But Mangala was talking about a smart patriotism, a middle path, if you will, and he was articulating that. And I think both Wara and Prabha might talk more to this. And I remember seeing something at the time. He was on a program discussing, well, he called it smart patriotism in relation to a young woman singer, Yohani, And he said to her, in the conversation, he talked about the new generation, the YZ generation, who were not looking back and narrowly defining what they were trying to do. They were looking forward, they were modernizing, they were using tropes from different places like hip hop and rap, and she was dressed in both sari and torn jeans, and she was embodying. I don't think he even knew who she was, but he was saying that that was the hope for the future. And finally, I have a few slides which I would ask Castro to just put up. I know I just have a minute. We'll just look at these 3 slides. They're just interesting slides. Or at least I think they're interesting. We can then stop the conversation or we can move on to the next speaker. I think the first slide shows the logo of the Mother's Front. So these are advertisements actually for both the 19th February, this was Richard's death anniversary in 1991 with the first launch of the Mother's Front publicly, the National Convention at the New Town Hall. And the other is a poster for the Devakanalawa, which really shook President Premadasa. And that was the logo I was talking about, which we can critique, but that was Mangala, the designer, to the fore, and the mothers there at the Devakanalawa. The other slide has a picture, and this is interesting. This is Mangala's, another avatar of Mangala as the dress designer with his brand Crossblood. And that shows Mangala on the left, and Akushla Selaya, who was part of Women for Peace in 1984, is modeling there. And these are photographs from Akushla's daughter when Mangala passed away, to say how distressed Akushla was at his passing. And that brand Crossblood, from which he designed clothes. And of course, the final is Mangala there, challenging the president, and also being depicted. This was when he passed away. Somebody put this up saying goodbye butterfly, and I think it's his legacy of a different Sri Lanka that I think we can also at some level dream about, and we need to try to put meaning to for a future that we need to also reimagine for ourselves in this very grave and difficult times. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kumi, for that very thoughtful, very nuanced presentation about Mangala's work as an activist and a politician, and also for those 3 images, which are very meaningful, and in a way they captured these different life phases of Mangala's career, I think. So our next presenter is Wara Thiyagaraja, who is an activist and lecturer at the University of Colombo. Wara, you may begin.
Thank you, Thiru. I think Kumi has made, Kumi's finishing was a good start for me. I think she somewhat touched upon the bit of a critical key aspect of Mangala's life, his identity as a queer person. I don't know, I don't have a specific PowerPoint or narrative to bring up, but I'd rather have a lot of questions to pose as a person who's working for the rights of transsexual and gender minorities. I think I was very saddened for the second time in my life to hear the demise of late Minister Mangala, and that was the second time that I was very shocked to hear passing away of a politician in the country. And then I was like, okay, so what's a lot of thoughts were going on, in ourselves, and Castro and myself, we were talking about, okay, how do we, understand this legacy? And also like by looking at the Facebook interactions and comments, particularly from the queer community. I mean, it something that actually reminded us that, that, there is a lot of expectation from the queer community to see a champion, somebody who would take the rainbow flag and, wave it against all those who's trying to oppress us. So that was the feeling that we got. And we were thinking, okay, so then it's perfect time to, reflect on what's Mangala's legacy or what's his role in the queer politics, or if at all, what was his approach. So that's when, we sort of start digging into, I mean, the history of, institutionalized queer politics in the country, which was started in 1995 with the first LGBTIQ organization called Companions in Journey, was initiated by Sherman DeRose. And then that, almost I think like 25 years have gone for the activism, right? And then if you look at Mangala's political career, it's also 3 decades long career, right? Starting in 1989, 88, I think. Then, becoming a minister in Chandrika's government, not just a minister, it's a very, it's a kind of a very close, he was very close to the center of power, right? And if you look at, I think more than half of his political life, he spent close to the circles of power, close to the center of power. So being a very powerful minister and someone who had always defended his identity whenever it is being questioned, to delegitimize him and demonize him, and demonizing any sort of attempts to imagine a rational understanding about politics, right? He often stood against queerphobia whenever it's questioned, and in that sense he was kind of it was a very, I think for us, I mean, to see a politician who's publicly defending his identity in a in a circle of politicians who tend to hide it often, and sometimes to go to an extent to speak against homosexuality, right? Mangala was a kind of a gem for many, right? And when he said that I would rather be a butterfly than a lead, it was the moment that, okay, yeah, we should do something, So that's one of the key trigger that we had when we started Butterfly for Democracy, initiatives afterwards during the coup. And then also looking at some of his recent how do you say interventions, right? And it was when he was the prime minister in 2016, Sri Lanka for the first time supported the at least Sri Lanka was one of the 84 countries that defeated the counter resolution put forward by African states calling for suspension of the UN independent expert on sexual and gender identities and related issues. Sri Lanka was very much in favor of that. And that was a key thing from the international scene. Sri Lanka, the country that has never been, supporting any of these initiatives for the first time, it came out after that. But whatever the motivation behind the strategic reason behind that decision, but the decision itself is a, important, marking. And then the following year, in 2017, I think he was also instrumental in the inclusion of the decriminalization into the National Plan of Action of Human Rights in 2017, at least in the draft, I think, which eventually got scrapped by the former president at the cabinet. So these are some of the, I think, in the national and international scene, the key things that his association became quite visible, right? And his instrumental role has become visible. Then the recent one was, the radical Madam Avata, right? Center radical. I don't know understand that. But whatever it is, as Kumi said, he had an imagination about different Sri Lanka, right? And he put together a group of individuals and different groups to start the journey, and which I think a group of LGBTIQ activists were also invited and given the platform to raise the issues that these communities been facing. And I was pretty much amazed. And soon I saw that press conference was featured by a transgender woman speaking about the issues that they face. I left a Facebook post saying that I am in a way amazed to see particularly the segment of a queer community that didn't actually like the idea of queer left, particularly JVP is taking over the rainbow flag, is now sitting with Mangala and talking about, how we're going to win our rights, right? Which is a political platform. So I thought like, the radical Madam Avata, his envisioning of radical Madam Avata had a space for those who didn't want to identify with the left, right? Even within the queer community. So that was, I think, like a quite important step that he took. So these are some of the development that I think we can obviously notice in his, political career, towards the later part of his political career. But then, can we color the, is it the whole, legacy that Mangala has as a politician who happened to be gay, right? So I thought like maybe I'll just go back and dig some of his role during Chandrika regime and, what was his contribution or what was his, understanding about, queer politics, So in 1995, when COD was started, and there were a lot of, oppression against the queer community or activism, and there were, the key incident was the criminalization of same-sex desires of women in 1995. This was happened in under the legal reforms brought by then Minister G.L. Pires, right? And my whole question was, okay, he was a minister in that regime, so where was he? What was his role, right? At least not to do and not make sure that this is going to happen. So this is one of the questions that I still have in my mind, right? And then we come into another era, like in the later stages, whenever the queer community went into crisis, like threats, facing threats, and a lot of number of sabotage against the queer movement. Where was he? What was his role? And then some of the understandings and things that we came to know is that more about what he has done behind the scenes, right? And so I think we know like he understood that he has to defend who he was, and there is a way forward for it. But I don't think he made it explicitly queer agenda as part of his a larger political mobilization project up until late, right? Recently. So I think it was more about saying that, look, you guys can work, but it would be very difficult for us to touch any queer mobilization. This was the sort of a obvious message that that was communicated by him to queer community whenever it reached out to him, to do this, let's do something, So someone who's being very, not upfront about queer issues, has completely, I wouldn't say blind, but completely, it's not up for it. Someone who wasn't up for it got changed towards the end of his career, right? Unfortunately, when he formed the Madam Avata. So I think that as Kumi said, it's a mixed legacy. I think he has always been a controversial figure, both for good and bad. I think he embodied what it means to be a queer person, but I don't think he explicitly, championed a queer agenda, or even if he ever wanted. I think, unfortunately, he's no longer with us. If he ever wanted to do it, when he's not in the mainstream politics, right? So I think Mangala's legacy, it tells a story about, the navigation, politically navigating one's own identity, and then, the larger political project that they are part of it, right? So sometimes I was also wondering, like, whether, are we supposed to expect more from such a politician, or are we supposed to, okay, that's it, and let's get our things done, whatever happens, So these are like, so I was thinking also, like, people like Sunil Babu Pant from Nepal, who had a actual legacy of being part of a queer movement and then becoming a member of the legislature with a different trajectory, right? And Mangala's trajectory is it's somewhat different from that trajectories. And I think sometimes one might also say it's personal, it's political, whatever is stood for it, it's also political. And obviously I was also wondering, like, if it would be the same politics if it's someone not from the same background as Mangala, right? So then I think these are some of the critical questions that we have to ask, which might actually help us, shaping queer movement, and also, clearing the whole political. I think I'll stop there. Thiru, I think, yeah, I'll stop there. I'll just throw a lot of questions, and I think, like, we can take more input from the conversation as well.
Thank you, Wara, for that interesting presentation in which you have kind of mapped the trajectory of Mangala's involvement and its limitations within the queer political movements. And you also highlighted, what Mangala did, but what Mangala would have done if he had alive. So, it's a very interesting way in which you have also framed all these different temporalities and the absences and the presences, and also, making us imagine, other possibilities that might have emerged had he lived. So thank you for that presentation. And our next speaker is Prabha Manuratne, who is an activist and senior lecturer at the University of Kelaniya. Prabha, you can begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Thiru. Good evening, everybody. I want to start by thanking Jaffna Sangam and my friends there, Wara, Thiru, for inviting me to this event. It's really an honor to be part of this conversation for many different reasons. But I will begin by invoking one of the influential figures in my life that really taught me to think about queer politics in terms of broad intersections. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, sorry.
Yes, we can.
In terms of broad intersections and in terms of thinking about coalitional politics, I would like to quote briefly from the Buffalo writer Leslie Feinberg, who is a transgender communist. And this is what she says, and I quote, "I believe we need to sharpen our view of how repression by the police, courts, and prisons, as well as all forms of racism and bigotry operates as gears in the machinery of the economic and social system that governs our lives. As all those who have the least to lose from changing the system get together and examine these social questions, we can separate the wheat of truths from the chaff of old lies. Historic tasks are revealed that beckon us to take a stand and to take action. That moment is now. And so this conversation with you takes place with the momentum of struggle behind it." And in the quote there, I want to start by with this quote and this idea of transliberation, and with the idea of how in the history of the queer movement in different parts of the world and at different points in time, in some moments we have managed to bring together different struggles. In Feinberg's case, Cuba, Palestine, working class. I mean, Z is a working class writer, so working class politics, all of this together. And I am even more touched listening to Kumi talk about the 80s, and the memories of so many things that happened in the 80s just came back. I was really moved hearing you speak, because I remember getting, I remember that little, like a little leaflet that was sent by the Mother's Front to the families of those who had lost people during the JVP violence. One of my neighbors had disappeared, a very close friend of mine. And it just came to the house. But that early encounter for me, at that time, I was still a child, is also shaped then by the activism that I came across maybe a decade later in the late 1990s, which is the time that Kumi was talking about, is after Chandrika's appointment as the president, or maybe I think just after. I remember Mangala kind of frequenting various art events, one of which was a project, an anti-war art project called Artists Against War. And some of his close associates and friends were part of the movement. So, and I always, as a very young person, I always thought of Mangala as this kind of figure who supported progressive events. But as both speakers before me have pointed out, he was also a very controversial figure, and one could never tell whether he was, I mean, which part of him was really serious. I mean, if you remember the Susantika comment, I just had a chat with Nirmal also, because I mean, from my political history, probably he was the one that was, he was close to Mangala. So just thinking about this now, and this event has really sort of given me a moment to think about that history and that past, and to think of Mangala as the person that I had seen in these various venues, and Mangala the politician, Mangala the, I don't know, the deal broker and deal breaker, I suppose, I don't know, in the sort of the larger national political scene. So it's a very complex and checkered history that Mangala has had. But I think one of the things that I would like to bring up, and maybe if we can even return to at some point, is what that late 1990s moment signified for young people like me, and and how I came to think about queer politics at that time and later. So for me, I think the term queer, while it recognizes the sexual identity of the queer community and their broader social identity, I also think the term queer suggests resistance to normative identities, prescriptions, you know, and that's not, it's not just only about a certain group of people. And for those of us who sort of think of ourselves, that's also a very complicated identity. You know, when you say left identities, I think that is a very complicated identity, feminist identity, and this is none of these are really just one simple thing. But for those of us who have to straddle these different identities and whose histories have sort of come together with Mangala's politics and then departed from it, as Kumi put it so beautifully. I mean, there were moments when you were very comfortable, and then there were moments when it was very uncomfortable. So, but within all of this, what I think maybe one could return to is maybe in the late 1990s, that cultural moment of questioning heteronormativity, of questioning the sort of the patriarchal politics, recognizing the links between patriarchy, capitalism, racism. These were big questions on our mind as young people at the time. So whether it is, whether we really reaped what we could have from that political moment remains a question, and I think that needs to be asked. As both the speakers before me commented, I think Mangala's separation of his personal life from his political life is symptomatic of the way that politics work in Sri Lanka, mainstream politics work in Sri Lanka. So, so Mangala didn't make an extra effort to hide his sexual identity, but he also didn't turn it into a sort of an emancipatory project that it could have become very easily. I mean, it could have been a part of a broader emancipatory process. But that process, I wonder if it ever came. I mean, we are also thinking about a time of a lot of possible. I mean, I voted for the first time in my life in 1994. It was such a year of hope. And then all of the sort of various missed opportunities, possibilities, and the broader coalition building that we could have done then, that we should be doing now. I mean, I don't know if we have ever even made that, bridge that gap still, but I think of the late 1990s that I associate with Mangala, the politician, mostly as such a moment, as a kind of a sort of a potential history, a history that could have been, where the queer community, as Wara mentioned, 1995 was companions on a journey. So it was quite new. This idea was quite new. I remember the X group in which I became a member a few years after the time that I'm talking about, but very early on had a lot of there was a lot of questioning. There was Foucault. There was a lot of there's a lot of excitement on our part that it was possible to do this kind of questioning. And somehow, sadly, I feel, and could be that I'm kind of getting older, but I feel like maybe we didn't really sort of capture that moment at a more cultural level, at a broader social level, whether we were able to capture the political passions of that moment to question patriarchy, heteropatriarchy, and capitalism, and all of that was, oppressing and racism that is oppressing many of us in this country. And Mangala was no left-wing politician. He was certainly no sort of economic. I don't think. I mean, I don't know. Maybe people will disagree with me, but I don't see Mangala as a kind of a left politician in terms of economics or even mainstream politics, to be honest. But I think he was part of a certain ethos, a certain feeling that we needed to question patriarchy and heterosexism and racism. So can we return to that? I mean, after that, we've seen the very, very bloody military end of the war, the civil war. And I think Mangala did play a role in that, and the sort of the political rhetoric of Sinhala Buddhist supremacy, and all of the things that we have been through since then, and all of the controversies that Mangala has been caught up in the process, and that we have had to kind of deal with as people who were interested in progressive politics. Perhaps for me, I think of this moment as an opportunity to return to those early moments of possibility, to maybe reflect on those, and to make the connections between our friends from a generation before us and our friends from the next generation. So in that vein, and in honor of both Mangala and Leslie Feinberg, I would like to quote again, repeat from Feinberg and end. That moment of reflection, I think, is now. And so the conversation with you takes place with the momentum of struggle behind it. Thank you.
Thank you, Prabha, for that really thought-provoking presentation. And Prabha's presentation focused on these key moments in Sri Lanka's post-independence history, I think 1994, the late 1990s. And it is within these periods or years that Mangala's activism come politics kind of unfolded, and the possibilities that we missed, Mangala missed, and the country as a whole missed. I think those reflections are very important, because I was also trying to recall 1994, I was small, but it was like seen as this moment of peace in the north also, when Chandrika Kumaratunga was contesting elections. We didn't have electricity, but people were just basically pedaling their bicycles and generating electricity to listen to the election results, like that particular night in August and also in November. So that hope, and then how in the 2000s everything became so militarized, and kind of Mangala also participated in the election of Mahinda Rajapaksa in 2005, and and as Prabha said, it's a checkered and complex legacy that we have to revisit. And maybe, as Wara put it, revisiting this legacy and introspecting into it is, I think, important to chart a broader emancipatory queer political movement. And also that kind of politics would also bring in questions like class and economy from a progressive angle. So thank you to all three presenters. And now the floor is open for questions, discussion, and comments. So if you put the hand raise icon, and then I will just mention your name and you can present your views. There is Niranjan's comment, maybe I'll just read it out. It was certainly remarkable to be openly queer while being a mainstream politician in Sri Lanka, and Mangala was certainly trailblazing in that regard. But the kind of politics that he was involved in was not queer politics by any means. Not to trivialize his legacy, but he was a part of right-wing politics all along. Mangala's ties into queer politics seemingly existed at a much more personal level. Painting Mangala as a paramount figure in queer politics is exactly opposite of what Mangala was standing for. Placing Mangala as a queer politician is on the one hand a betrayal to queer politics, and on the other hand disrespectful toward the ideological political stance that he had been taking throughout. I was just just to open the floor, in all these three presentations, there is something that I noticed, these openings, possibilities, right? And then the possibilities sort of disappear. And also the kind of transitions, Mother's Front starting as this very hopeful kind of movement, and then that is kind of co-opted by mainstream politics. So, and Mangala was part of it in a way, propelling this sort of processes of co-opting. And so I was wondering, how would we understand the relationship between politics and activism, or mainstream politics and activism, through the lens of the work Mangala did and didn't do, and the kind of transitions that happened And then I think he also reflected on some of the things that he did. Like, for instance, somebody posted on Twitter recently, like when he passed away, that he was at Colombo Villa Hospital when Lasantha Vikramatunga was assassinated, and he was tearing up, and he said, I have brought this murderous regime to power, and I feel very bad and sorry about it. So I think, what is the role? A related question could be what it means to reflect upon our own politics. Is there a way in which we are all learning, and is there any lessons that we can take away from Mangala's political life? Although, as all of you have rightly said, it was complex and checkered, but is there anything that we can kind of also learn from it, in terms of activism, politics, reflection, introspection? Just an open question, any of you can respond.
I think, let me go. Let me start.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thanks. And Niranjan raised a very valid question. I think we don't want to, as like what I said at the beginning, I think by looking at the responses with this demise, particularly came from the queer community. It's more about, the expectation that queer community has, the void in the politics that the queer community wants to represent, right? So it's not necessarily about, what Mangala's politics was. It's mostly about the gap. The gap, and then our reflection process today is also indicating a gap between, there's a huge grievance accumulating, sphere, and there's a gap in the politics that, people trying to mainstream and mobilize to, champion to advance that agenda, right? And sadly, people tend to attribute those things, so it's also, we have to understand it's the momentum of, somebody has passed away, so people wouldn't be that, nasty and critical about things. So people tend to be, mourn and, feel that we have lost at least somebody who was there to defend himself in the politics, right? So with regard to queer politics, I think Niranjan, you are correct in a way. I think maybe Mangala didn't ever want to be a, outright a queer politician, right? He wasn't, maybe interested in, being painted as such, figure, right? He was just doing what he thought it was his time to do things, right? But I think but I noticed, a change in his approach to politics, particularly on the issues of queer community, right? Someone who thought this is not a time to bring queer issues. You do whatever you want, but don't bring it into the table. It's difficult. And later on, someone completely changing to an extent where he brings the queer community onto his platform, right? And this, change is remarkable. I think a change that I'm pretty sure many in the queer community and those who are in the, politics, and every individual who spoke and stood for their identity have contributed during the last few, 20 years, right? Particularly, I think the amplified visibility that the queer movement has gained since the 2015, right? And then also the JVP taking over the pride flag, right? In a way, must have had a impact on, it's time the politicians would speak about it, right? And then particularly this pride witnessed most number of politicians endorsing pride events, right? I mean, at least in the Twitter space, I would say, which wasn't the case before, right? So I think, I mean, I wouldn't be, hurried to paint Mangala as the, queer politician that had a queer agenda as such. But I think Mangala had an agenda that didn't compromise its queer identity, right? Which is quite difficult for many other politicians, right? In that sense, one could actually also see it as a radical positioning of himself, right? And even in the last election, we have seen individual politicians coming out and against, when they were accused of being queer, then they, come back with a, extremely homophobic statement, saying, trying to confirm with heteronormativity, right, framework. So I think, yeah, maybe I think it's also important what are the yardsticks that we're going to use to assess our politics. Sometimes the yardsticks are too, I would say, like too idealistic in a way to assess. No? So I just stop there.
Maybe if I could respond to that, Thiru, I think it's also, I think it's also about the moment. It's also about, if there is one lesson one should learn from Mangala is to never delay one's politics. No, this pandemic was unforeseen, and there were many sort of, posts on Facebook of people saying he was reorganizing, he was trying to link with the new generation, which I think he did in the 90s also from, what I have heard anecdote. I have never known him personally, even though I have met him in person at several venues. I've never really talked to him. But anecdotally, even in the 90s, even before that, I think he's someone who wanted to link with the new and do new things. But at the same time, he was a shrewd politician. So he was part of the system. He was not outside the system. He couldn't be this, queer, he couldn't bring his queer identity and do the kind of politics that he did. He was in a mainstream political party. He was straddling the Sinhala nationalist line. So I think to sort of try to make a hero out of him, as as both of you have been saying, I think it would be, would not be the way to go. But I also think that that then tells us much about the way we are compelled to sort of work in the political sphere. Because, on the one hand, all of it depends on elections and winning elections and rights and legal frameworks, so sort of popular, the popular appeal that a politician has to have versus what you really want to do. But I think, as you were asking, Thiru, if you were to think of, what is the lesson, then I think the lesson would be to never delay the real politics that you want to do. If this last stage, one never knows when, once you have passed on, what we can only speculate that he was trying to do something different and something new. We have seen the Mother's Front being betrayed. We have seen the peace movement being betrayed. It's been a history of these betrayals. That's not only Mangala's fault, but he was such a part of it. So I think maybe, Thiru, the lesson for all of us might be, for all of us who, are active and thinking about politics, is also to maybe never delay the politics that we want to do. The moment, given the pandemic, given the very depressing situation in this country right now, one would think that the moment would never be in the future, that it would always be now. And
thank you, Prabha.
Yeah, I think to add to that, when I look back at 1995, when Wara raised the question of the penal code reforms, right, and what was Mangala doing? Mangala was in government. I think what we need to remember is, just looking at the penal code reforms, decriminalization was put up. Decriminalizing abortion was put up, and there was something else. I think marital rape was also part of the draft reforms. And the Catholic Church mobilized, actually, and GL panicked, and GL then withdrew all this. And of course, with the extension of 365A to women, that was an absolute addition. But at that moment, I think we didn't really have a movement that could inform those reforms. Not with, I mean, even the feminist movement was not something that had, you know, that was at that point influential. With regard to queer work, Companions on a Journey had just started, Women's Support Group was to emerge a little later. And there was nothing on the ground to propel the change, to defend the change. And the Catholic Church just moved it. And I remember GL saying, he said he will revisit. Now look at the question of abortion. We've still not got it decriminalized after so many years of the presence of the feminist movement in women's politics, right? So I think the importance actually is also that to understand that one personality, somebody even in government, cannot by themselves bring this change about. They don't work in a vacuum. They don't exist in a vacuum. And it's the same with the national question. You know, there are many progressive positions he had, but he was within government. He was both co-opted, he co-opted government, he did lots of things. And this was the controversy around Mangala's politics. But I think it also paved the way when I look at the constitutional reform processes that came afterwards, the transitional justice mechanisms. I think he was able to influence the laying of the groundwork. Now, even the human rights, the National Action Plan, yes, again, the clause on decriminalizing was removed, but the fact that it got into the National Action Plan was also a result of concerted activism in the queer community. I remember I was there in those discussions where we put it into 2 or 3 different places of that plan, and he couldn't defend it when it was withdrawn. But it also begs the question about how we see the building of ground support. And I think that's work we have to do. That's not work a politician will do for us. And it is only that groundswell, I think, that will give us the change we really look for. And yes, I mean, you don't know, and like Prabha said, this, you know, you take that moment as it comes. If you look at this time, when Mangala, it's interesting that he chose not to be in formal parliamentary politics. He didn't contest. He was a politician outside, and that was, I think, for the first time in his life, he didn't stand for elections. And then whatever he was trying to do, whether it would have worked or not, or how he envisioned it, he was now doing as a politician who was not in parliament. Whether he would have succeeded, how that would have worked, I don't know. But I think our mobilization, our activism is something we need to be introspective, I think, in relation to our work as well. So although the mid-90s were an important, interesting moment, I think the mobilization around it that came from civil society, we lost. And that's something we need to reimagine, recreate, reposition. Yeah.
Thank you all 3 presenters and all 3 responses or comments. I also thought about it, like, you know, in terms of like the political class, especially the mainstream political parties and the kind of politicians and their class as, like, you know, as a category, that we might see, like, you know, there are these ruptures, like, you know, Mangala being slandered for being gay. But, like, you know, as Prabha said, he was also straddling the singular nationalist terrain, right? So I think those are, like, you know, we might think that political class is very complex and fragmented and all of that, but then we can't basically rely on those fragmentations for some emancipatory politics to emerge. I think, as Kumi put it, like, you know, it's the civil societies, activists and others who organize and, like, you know, work on the ground and create a kind of a mobilization that is so important, I think. And that also speaks to what Niranjan said, Anybody else who has a question or comment, if you can raise your hand, we can take your question. And Castro, are we getting any questions from Facebook?
Not yet. I am monitoring. Not yet.
Not yet.
If I will get, I will let you know.
Yeah. Can anyone share about Mangala's personal life with his family?
With his family?
Yes.
Well, I worked with his sister for a bit after Manic Farm. And I may be wrong, but I think we got access to do some work in Manic Farm. We started working in the infectious diseases hospital. That was the only place they allowed us to go into. And I have a feeling that Mangala was instrumental in trying to get us that access. But she and he were very, very close. She's quite devastated by his loss. She's the one I know. I mean, I don't know anything. I don't know anything about this question in a sense why you asked this question, but I know Mangala was very close to her. The thing with Mangala, another thing that I know I experienced with him is that he was very, very generous in his hospitality, you know, and I think this comes from his old art center days in the 70s, 80s. Very bohemian. His house, I think he opened his home to many people. Of course, you couldn't just walk in, but he constantly had people around, milling around. And somebody else who worked with him, Lakshmi Jagannathan, I remember he would always try to celebrate her birthday. So he, in that sense, he had that sort of, you know, banchung party thing with people he really was close to. I don't know what that means in relation to family. I didn't see him interacting with Janti, his sister's children, or, you know, except Janti would always talk about him very affectionately.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Sabrina. I
Yes.
got discussed for a bit. I don't know if I'm. You asked for questions, right? You opened the.
Yes. Questions, comments. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for for those talks. When I saw the title itself, I was instantly interested because, you know, as you pointed out, it's sort of straddling that, you know, immediately thoughts are straddling the political and personal, and you talked about it, especially in terms of revisiting the past. And one of the things that you sort of highlighted is that outside the issue of sexuality, right, the aspect of queering. I was just wondering, like like Dr. Prabha was talking about some of those moments, like they were famous quote, when the coup happened, right, which was brought in as an insult, but in certain communities, it became a slogan of resistance, I think. What does that sort of mean in terms of today? So now with his death and passing away, it resurfaces all these different discourses of possibilities and all of that. I was wondering, what would that mean today in terms of where we are located now, and what other forms of queering that his sort of approach may be influencing potentially? Yeah.
Thank you for the question. Maybe I'll just try to respond. It was a big question, and I'm not sure that I have an answer to it. But I think particularly, and I don't know if people have registered this enough when talking about Mangala, the fact that he passed away as a result of the pandemic that has killed many people, left many people destitute. This is another moment. This is also a moment that we will sort of, if we get through this, that we will look back on and think, you know, it was one of those moments. So I think to sort of, I think revisiting the past is helpful for thinking about what we can do now. And to me, queering politics always involves bringing the resistance that the queer community has into the broader political spectrum, and getting the broader political spectrum, whether in activism or political parties or whatever, to recognize that fighting for queer rights is just as important as fighting for all other rights that we fight for. So to think of that intersectionality and to not to separate this out. And I mean, I think that's what all of us have been saying, more or less, you know, the separation that that Mangala had to maintain, whether it is by choice, whether he was forced to, we don't know. It's probably a mix of a lot of complex reasons. But for us, I think, thinking about the pandemic today and thinking about how the pandemic affects us, you know, people in this country so disproportionately. I mean, the one sort of other moment that many people and I have been thinking about is the early days of the AIDS, you know, the spreading of AIDS, and the way the queer community was kind of targeted as people who were, you know, spreading the disease, you know. So there's a lot of history there that is kind of repeating, but in very different ways. So, you know, this pandemic doesn't affect everybody in the same way, but it does kill everyone. You know, the wrong person, wrong time, wrong health condition, wrong assumptions about one's abilities and health can get any one of us, you know, infected or killed. So I think in some ways we will take time to register that even Mangala, you know, who is not, you know, from you know, he's not an underprivileged person. He's not someone who may not have had access. Whether he used it or not, I don't know. I don't know if he was vaccinated even. I don't know. I have never known him personally, but I think these are the questions, the kind of inequalities that are going to shape how this pandemic will unfold, the way it's going to affect the queer community, the way it's going to affect women, the way it's going to affect the poor. I mean, I think for me, revisiting those moments, it's like the war. It's like the war in the I mean, in the 80s, it was the violence, the human rights violations. You know, those were moments of crisis that were also moments of possibilities. And I think it's so ironic that someone like Mangala would. I mean, it's just a political irony for me. That, I mean, I know, as long as, it could be me very personally, but as long as he was alive, I think of someone like Mangala as, you know, quite versatile and invincible, and you don't associate something like death with a figure like that. So perhaps I think which is why I it's like the sort of the pressing of time that I feel when I think of his passing, and of the opportunities that this moment is offering for us to kind of think beyond the kind of pragmatic politics of the moment to what potential we have as a historical moment. I don't know if that makes, I don't think that answers the question, but I just wanted to put that out there.
No, it does. Thanks, Dr. It's interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can I actually ask a question? Are panelists allowed to ask questions
Sure.
panelists?
Sure. That's completely fine. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask Kumi, you know, in the 1990s, after Chandrika came to power, and there was a lot of power brokering going on from what we could tell. Was there a sense of, you know, how did the activist community respond to that? As people who had worked closely with these figures, did you feel disheartened? Did you feel like that's a part of, you know, we need to work with that? Or did you feel angry? How did you, I'm just curious to know how y'all dealt with that reality.
I mean, like I said before, we were not working in a vacuum. The war was going on. The LTT was very much in the ascendancy. Maybe we were a little naive in expecting that she could solve a lot of the problems, and particularly that she could negotiate a political solution. And I think at the start, in the early years, she really tried. The first round of talks with the LTT were actually brokered by Father Tissabala Surya, Charles Abesekara, and Lionel Fernando, I think. Yeah. And I remember I was working with Charlie then, and Charlie was really optimistic every time he went up to Jaffna and came back. But it was not to be. And it was partly, I mean, I think a solution was such a complex thing. And it was not possible. And although we pinned our hopes on the government, on Chandrika, I think there was no way she could deliver. There was a moment when she did not go to war. She tried. And then with the bombing of the Trincomalee Harbour, and there were lots of other issues, I think, that built up. It was not just the LTT. And she had to, listen to the military, if you will. So there was no turning back after that. And I think we were not mobilized strongly enough to carry on the demand for a resolution to the conflict. And I think even with the question of the disappearances commissions, I mean, if you look at it, the disappearances were the result of militant and military activity. The army was culpable, and there was no way she could hold the army accountable because she needed the army to fight the war. So there were lots of contradictions in this, I think. And I think that is why it's difficult. I mean, I would say immediately, yes, we were very disappointed, but I think that's not an easy answer to give to this very complex set of problems. And I think it is true for today as well. I think even if Mangala was able to build something in a way futuristic, in a way, reimagined, he would still have, and everybody within that movement, as we have to now, still have to deal with authoritarianism, nationalisms of all kinds, whole range of things, and a very sort of heteronormative, homophobic polity. None of that has actually changed. I mean, I don't know, when I was listening to that clip about young people and he was talking about Rouhani, I think he was sort of projecting a sense that maybe the future, he says it's not a political song that she sings. I think she sings, what is it? Andakare, something. But he says, you can't keep looking back at the Dukamnu or the Mahavamsa. You have to move forward. And you have to reimagine, and young people maybe are doing this. You need to borrow from everywhere and move into the future. I don't know whether that was, I mean, I don't know, who's to know, but I think for ourselves also, it's something to think about. What do we mean by this moment? Like you said, Prabha, so many inequalities that have surfaced with the pandemic. And so much of structural inequalities and violence that we've never dealt with. And where will we go with this? I must say, I mean, I don't know, I've been part of, I don't know, when did I come into this kind of work? Somewhere in the late 70s. And that's many, 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 many years ago. And I look at it now and I think, oh my God, what have we achieved? I feel quite depressed, honestly. But it's your time now. It's you, Varas, Thiru, Castro, all of you. I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? Sahan, yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sahan. I actually missed the first part of the this lecture, so I am sorry if I don't know whether you already talked about this, but what I actually want to ask is now Mangala had it seemed like he was launching some sort of a movement of some sort, like which was like at the tail end of his career. Just want ask what do you think going forward, Mangala's legacy in terms of how it be carried forward? Is it over? Is it like, do you feel that it has with him it ends, or how do you see it playing, sort of going forward? How it will play out in the sort of the political environment in the coming years? Just an open question to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Maybe I can go. Okay. So I don't know. I mean, to be honest, I mean, I think, I mean, none of us expected, Mangala's passing away. So it was a very unexpected and I mean, as I said in my, presentation, when I saw, queer community on the platform, Madam Mouth, I was so happy, and somebody is also mobilizing queer community, into the mainstream politics somehow, right? And I don't know. I mean, but I think, like as Prabha said, never delay your politics. No? So I think it what I understood, the queer community is also very diverse. There are a lot of segments within that, along different lines of other identities as well. So to bring that, into focus is that, try to, find other versatile ways of mobilizing community. So what I think is, political versatility is a much needed skill and art that we have to master in a way to make coalitions and, and so that sometimes means like, we have to give up our, virginity of certain ideas, right? So you got to be, I mean, I don't know, I mean, like, we're not gonna navigating in a very smooth, way, it's a very difficult path, and we're not working in a vacuum, as Kumi said, nobody's working in a vacuum, there are a lot of things happening on the ground, the triumph of nationalisms and, militant, way of ruling, right? And then, a lot of other, new contradictions are emerging, right? So like, it's also about, I think, I don't know whether Mangala has ever stepped out of his right-wing economic agenda, but I think he had a different way of reaching out to other constituencies, right? The human rights agenda and, accommodating minority rights and, those things, right? Shows another way of, making allies, right? So maybe, I don't know who's going to take it forward, because I think like his charisma had a role to play in bringing that platform a reality. But I don't know, without his presence, how far that is going to sustain. I saw somewhere Nirmal has posted, Nirmal or somebody has posted on Facebook saying maybe Sanaskala can replace it, rather ironically, right? Sarcastically, right? I was just like, well, I mean, even if it was a sarcastic post, I was thinking like, someone with such a versatility, of course, all the contradictions is, part of that versatility, right? Like today, like Maskala is banned for 30 days, I think, from Facebook for talking against this, media coverage about women who are engaged in sex work, right? And some of these issues, I think, even for the left movement, right, we cannot wait until the equal society can emerge. You have to take up such initiatives. So then those are the areas that we can make a bridge between different aspirations of the group. So I think for people like Hadwa in the queer movement and working on social justice issues, right, we have to we have to master the way of negotiating with different aspirations and bring a minimum consensus at least forward, right? Maybe I thought like in terms of person-wise, I don't know who's going to take that forward, but I think the lesson for us is also trying to be more versatile and never delay the politics that you want to do, and yeah, I don't have a perfect answer for you, sadly. Maybe Kumi and Prabha can come.
I don't know. I think a lesson to learn from Mangala is that we need to go back to the drawing boards. If we look at the essence of what he tried to embody, I think what he's meant to all of us was the question of how do you express identity whilst respecting diversity and difference, and whether that was a single identity, a queer identity, whatever the identity, a Buddhist identity, whatever. And I think in Sri Lanka, we don't respect diversity and difference, not only vis-a-vis the queer community, vis-a-vis ethnic communities, vis-a-vis religious communities, we absolutely don't. And I think that's something very important that we need to also come to terms with. We need to work towards. That's unfinished, very much part of an unfinished revolution. The other, I think, is our sort of necessity to have a leader. We've always had, there is somebody who's going to lead us out of all of this into salvation. And I think the way, I think we need to also understand, how do we work together? How do we be inclusive? And how does leadership get constructed and shared? And maybe that's another thing we need to think about, without waiting for this one person figurehead to lead us. What is it? What is it in English?
The vanguard, is that what you're looking for?
I mean, let's not wait for that, I think that's the other thing. How are we going to be inclusive? Because I think the Tamil community needs a particular kind of leadership that Mangala may not have ever been able to give it. The Muslim community, the women, whoever. And I think that how do we work with all these different elements and leaderships? I'm just thinking aloud. Yeah.
No, and I just also maybe want to emphasize what Kumi said about education. I think that's a struggle that we need to find a way to mainstream this deep need to learn to live with differences, whether it's sexual identity, women's gender, ethnic identity, whatever it is. I mean, we live in I think more than maybe even my time now. I mean, just looking at the students we get, and many of you here teach, so you probably have this experience, coming from a very, very conservative training. And it's very difficult for young people to unlearn the kind of conservative training they're being given in school. I don't think in the 80s, I mean, I don't remember social studies being particularly exciting, but I don't think it was this bad. So, students are fed these various ideologies. Even by the time they leave school, they have learned how not to respect another person, another community, another religion. So I think, I mean, I just want to sort of maybe piggyback on what you said and emphasize that again, because that is an area that many of us can get involved in and can do something about. And the other thing is, I mean, I think it is to Mangala's credit that he didn't have this messiah complex, you know, this need to be the leader of. I think we should grant him that. And he was, fantastic in being humble about what he could have been, and I think that would not be unfair to say. And of course, as Wara was saying earlier, I mean, we have to stop looking for people's political virginity, and we have to stop waiting for a leader. I mean, that messiah, I mean, I don't feel very young anymore either, even, but that messiah never came. That bus never came. So I don't think we need to wait for leaders. I think it's time to sort of recognize that, Kumi was saying, you feel like you didn't achieve anything, but actually that is the path. As Reggie Thiruvarangan translated Malcolm Machado. Sorry, I'm being in a very literature kind of mood today, but the path, that is the path. It is the footsteps. There is, like, where do we turn? I mean, our walking is what we do. So in that sense, I totally agree that this, the Messiah is never going to come. Not in politics. Maybe other messiahs will, but not in politics.
Any other questions?
Niranjan has a comment.
Yeah, I'll read it. I also think it is too soon to demystify Mangala's role in queering politics. Perhaps the public consciousness about Mangala's legacy is caught up with sentimentality. In the hindsight, Mangala's close association with the civil society was well in line with the right-wing politics that he was serving, and not to mention how NGOization proliferated in countries like Sri Lanka due to the economic liberalization. I don't know whether, we are engaged in a process of demystifying, but I think the panelists have been so great in, unpacking all these, complex moments that Mangala was part of. Mangala was a complex person, but then, the moments are also very complex. And, on the one hand, we have economic liberalization, and then you wanted to resolve the national question, and then what is going to happen? It's very difficult, instead of, without addressing the class question, you can't, talk about the national question. I think it has been difficult. That's one of the reasons why I think, after every peace process, which was accompanied by neoliberal kind of reforms in the economic sphere, then what you would expect is a shift towards the right? That happened in 2005, and then that happened again in 2019. I think maybe Mangala didn't realize that, that may be one of those things, he was part of these two phases, I think 1994 to 2005, and then again 2015 to 2019. So both these were in certain ways, I think for the minority ethnic communities, it's kind of these were moments that signified possibility and hope, but then they were also coupled with economic liberalization. But I was also reminded now, when we are talking about economic liberalization and Mangala's kind of right-wing economic policies, in Jaffna, the cooperative sector, Mangala contributed quite a lot to revive the cooperative sector, and there was a well-meaning tribute from the cooperative community when he passed away. So that in a way showed, and then Ahilan Kadargama wrote about it, although he disagreed with his macroeconomic vision, but he also showed on certain occasions that it was state intervention was so important. I think maybe Mangala saw state intervention in the cooperative sector as part of the reconciliation thing, because sometimes reconciliation is also understood merely as constitutional reforms, like, rights and all of that, but what about materially, how you want to rebuild communities and what kind of material support is necessary for communities to revive themselves. So in that sense, I think Mangala had that understanding, at least to some extent. And the next important measure was, I think, the way he tried to tackle the microfinance companies in the north, and they were extremely exploitative, and Mangala was sensitive to the problems that women were facing from microfinance community. So, like, although within his broad neoliberal vision, you would also see these, like, interesting moments also, I think, right? And I don't know, like, maybe like as a final point, is anybody, does anyone have a question? Otherwise, like,
I just thought that because you brought up the issues in the north, I think I had a brief assignment with him when he was a foreign minister, where we had to negotiate with
the fishing.
Delhi with Delhi for the fisheries issue. I think, of course, I mean, I was helping the fisheries delegation and the fisheries minister, and the approach, he was rather, I would say, very consultative and very conscious about the demands of the fishermen. And I think at the table, he made sure some of those issues aren't compromised. And then it was clearly not a giving in situation. I think it made it possible because he was, he respected the consultative process and the interest of the fishermen in the table. So I felt like, there are other domains. I mean, although he was very much vocal about those issues, but in his capacity, when it comes to issues that he do not often willing to take up as part of the mainstream reconciliation process, I think he made sure that at least those issues are addressed to an extent. So yeah, just wanted to add, because the fisheries issue.
No, that was great. That was also mentioned in the statement about the poaching by Indian trawlers, and he tried to intervene, and that was the first cabinet level kind of discussion between India and Sri Lanka on this issue. So that was also an important moment. Any other questions? I think, like, maybe like this may be like the last point. I think any of the panelists might respond if you want. Prabha spoke about Mangala's demise during this pandemic, and because he was kind of succumbed to the pandemic, right, in a way. And he's also memorialized at a time, like, the pandemic is still going on, and then, like, there is also this huge economic crisis that the country is facing. And, like, when I saw, like, some of these tweets when he passed away, they were kind of focusing on, like, how Mangala's economic vision would have taken the country out of the mess, and, like, the petrol price formula that he introduced. So, like, there is also, like, how do, and I'm talking about it not because I agree with those tweets, I'm very critical, but I'm trying to get at is, like, I think this conversation that we have had, I think is also a conversation about memorialization. How do we remember somebody? How do we remember a legacy? How do we remember a historical moment or different historical moments? And how do we capture the complexities? And then, like, even as we remember, how do we talk about absences, and how do we think about possibilities in the future, right? So I was wondering, like, this is like a meta conversation, like, we are doing a memorial event, but then we are also talking about memorialization. I was wondering whether you would like to throw any light on, like, what role I think memory plays, and what role memory ought to play in moments like this, when, like, we are on the one hand devastated by crises, and even devastated by the demise of Mangala, because he stood out for a number of reasons. So how do we, like, what memory means to us at this moment? Like, I just thought of, like, putting that question on the table.
I think for me, I'd like to say it's a great question. It's really tough questions here, but I think for me, I mean, it's been a very emotional evening for me. I didn't expect that. I have to say that. Just having to have this conversation itself, and the sort of how diverse we are in our backgrounds, in our age, in our experience, and Thiru, for me, memory is not personal. I think our memories are very collective. We remember through others, and we remember, other people remember through us. And I think the way I see it, the way we will remember this moment of memorialization will depend on how the next 5 years, 10 years will unfold. I mean, memory really for me is something of the future. Like, we don't know how this moment is going to be remembered until we know how this moment is going to kind of play out. So while stuff, what, and I think, like, we remember other people's pasts in the same way that, we remember Mangala's past, and we remember other people's sorrows and other people's tragedies. And that's part of our memory too, the things that people did, the things that they could never do, the things that were impossible to do. And I think that's what this conversation has been about. So I think for me, it's about, gathering more memories, sometimes painful, sometimes very emotional, sometimes very inspiring, but it's about, keeping the sort of our collective memories going, and then hoping that this moment will be remembered in a better light than we think of it today.
Thank you. Any final thoughts? Like, panelists, do you want to say anything? Last words?
I would just respond to that question on memorializing. I think maybe one of the hardest things in this pandemic has been the fact that people infected, quote unquote, with COVID and who have to die alone. And I think that's something that accepting during the time of the war, when many people died alone, suddenly, particularly in the South, we've had to come to terms with the fact that people do die, that this is the time in which it's the tragedy that you die alone, and there's no way, the only way you can remember that is through some form of memorializing. And it's a very emotive question, observation, Thiru, because in the North and the East, we know many people memorializing is still not possible in relation to who was lost during the war. I think in the South as well, during the time of the 89-90 period, you couldn't, there were times when you couldn't bury your dead, you couldn't mourn your dead, you couldn't memorialize. And it became a very personal observation. And in that, we've never had justice for those losses, whether South or North. People have had to live with that. And I think that's something that Mangala's death also brings to the fore. In terms of the kind of memory, I think that we can take, the way we can memorialize Mangala, for me, is in those moments in time, like, for example, in 95 in the Mother, I mean, in the 90s in the Mother's Front, he gendered, in a way, he helped to gender human rights. If you're looking at the question of a resolution to the national question, issues of devolution and even federalism was something that came into the public domain because of some of the work he was part of. And then finally, the question of transitional justice and reconciliation mechanisms. I think yes, that resolution was very ambitious. It was not possible to see it to fruition, but the fact of it, the fact that it is there, and the fact that we still have to see truth and justice, and we still need a mechanism of accountability. And I think that's something he stood for. And of course, his personal identification with his queerness, whether or not, I mean, obviously it didn't translate into a huge movement, but as a politician, the fact that he stood up and stood for that part of his identity, I think these are all his legacy that we need to build on. So thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Can I also very briefly
Sure.
say thank you to everybody. It has been such an honor being part of this panel, being part of this conversation for many different reasons. And I want to thank the organizers for inviting me because, back in May when we were marching on Women's Day, seeing the queer community joining us was, like one of those really joyous moments with the pride umbrellas and everything. I mean, just somewhere deep inside, we can't march, we can't leave the house, but I hope at least these conversations will keep our connections going, and sort of keep our love going more than anything else. So thank you very, very much, Castro and everyone else in the team. And Thiru, of course, for your wonderful moderation as always. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wara, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I think I echo both of you, I think. And thank you, Castro, for pioneering this. I think it was Castro's idea initially to have one in Tamil. And then we thought of, okay, which was a great success. Then we thought we'll have one in English, maybe the Sinhala one soon. I think this is the momentum to, reflect and to change. So we created that space, and that is much needed space, I think. And then it's Castro's birthday today. So Castro, happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Castro.
Thank you.
So it's the perfect timing to celebrate your birthday.
Happy birthday, and thank you for sharing the day with us.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you all the panelists for the great reflections that you shared with us about Mangala's life and legacy and work, all of that. And also everybody who contributed to the discussion, those who asked questions, posted comments, thank you so much. And I would like to thank Jaffna Sangam and CWDF for inviting me to chair this or moderate this session. It's such an honor. So I'm we have had a really thought-provoking conversation, I think, and we have also memorialized Mangala in a unique way, I would say, right? Yeah, thank you. I think we can now wind up. So thanks everybody for watching this discussion online and everybody who joined via Zoom. Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
So I will stop this live.